The Murder of Julia Wallace, an Impossible Mystery. Welcome to Ontario Cold Cases, Canada's true crime podcast, where we unravel the chilling stories that haunt history. Today we step beyond our borders to England into a saga that gripped the nation during the 1930s and to this very day. On a dark January evening in 1931, a peculiar phone message set in motion one of the most perplexing murder cases in British history. The victim was 52-year-old Julia Wallace, found bludgeoned to death in the parlor of her Liverpool home. The prime suspect was her seemingly mild-mannered husband, William Herbert Wallace, who claimed an alibi as strange as the crime itself, involving a fictitious client, a mysterious telephone call, and an address that did not exist. What followed was a real-life whodunit that baffled police, captivated the public, and has inspired endless debate among crime writers and armchair detectives for nearly a century. In the annals of true crime, the Wallace case has earned a reputation as the nonpareil of all murder mysteries. A puzzle so confounding, the famous mystery novelist Raymond Chandler called it the impossible murder. In this episode, we explore the classic mystery of Julia Wallace's murder in depth, laying out all the known facts and theories so that you, the listener, can weigh the evidence and decide for yourself what really happened on Wolverton Street that winter night. Hello, I'm Jay Nichol of Nichol Investigations. This is Ontario Cold Cases, Canada's true crime podcast. Ontario Cold Cases is a gripping true crime podcast that shines a light on unsolved murders, disappearances, and forgotten crimes from across the province and the world. With meticulous research, compelling storytelling, and a commitment to historical accuracy, we bring you the real stories of victims, investigators, and suspects, stories that demand to be heard. Each week, we take you deep into the world of true crime with a packed schedule of episodes. Tuesdays, historical true crime cases, exploring infamous and obscure crimes from history. Wednesdays, the Mick and Mac Mysteries, a thrilling fictional detective series set in 1950s Toronto. Thursdays, World Cold Case Thursday, investigating unsolved cases from around the globe. Sundays, Ontario Cold Cases, the latest episode uncovering an unsolved mystery from Ontario. From high-profile crimes that shock the nation to little-known cases waiting for justice, we uncover the truth, one case at a time. Join us as we explore the dark corners of history and mystery, where every clue could lead to answers and every case deserves a second look. Subscribe now wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts and never miss an episode of Ontario Cold Cases, Canada's true crime podcast. Background. William Herbert Wallace and his wife Julia lived a quiet, unassuming life that gave little hint of tragedy. William, 52, was a tall, thin man with round spectacles and a drooping mustache. A decade earlier, he lost a kidney to illness and afterwards suffered periodic bouts of poor health. Originally from Cumberland in northern England, Wallace had worked as a draper's assistant and even spent time in Asia before poor health brought him back home. By 1931, he was employed as a collections agent, the man from the Prue, as insurance salesmen were colloquially known, with the Prudential Assurance Company in Liverpool. He was methodical and educated, a man who taught himself chemistry and Latin and who enjoyed philosophy and music in his spare time. In happier moments, William played violin to accompany Julia, an accomplished pianist, during cozy musical evenings at their home. Julia Dennis Wallace was about 69 years old, significantly older than her husband, a fact not widely known at the time. She'd grown up an orphan and reinvented her past to appear more genteel. By all accounts, Julia was a devoted wife and a quiet, home-loving woman who doted on their pet cats and tended their modest household. The couple had no children and no close family nearby. They resided at 29 Wolverton Street in Anfield, a working-class district of Liverpool. Their home was a typical red brick Victorian terraced house, indistinguishable from the others on the block. A 2-story row house with a tiny front yard and a cramped back alley. It was here in this ordinary house on an ordinary street that an extraordinary murder would occur. It was in the front parlor of this house at 29 Wolverton Street, Anfield, that Julia Wallace was found murdered on January 20th, 1931. The neighboring houses, number 27 on the left, number 31 on the right, were home to the Holmes and Johnston families, who figured in the aftermath. Such unassuming terraced homes formed the backdrop to a crime that would grip the nation. In the winter of 1931, life in Liverpool was bleak. The city was in the grip of economic depression and a flu epidemic, and the weekend before the tragedy had brought fierce gales and dense fog to the area. Both William and Julia had been under the weather with influenza in the days leading up to the crime. William later said he'd even considered skipping his usual Monday night outing to the chess club on January 19th, 1931, because he was still recovering from the flu and Julia was battling bronchitis. But Julia encouraged him to go. That small decision, a husband going out to play chess while his ailing wife stayed home, set in motion a chain of events that would end in brutal murder. Timeline of key events. To understand the sequence of this mystery, it helps to review the key events in chronological order. Below is a brief timeline of the Wallace case's crucial moments. Monday, January 19, 1931, evening. William Wallace attends his chess club at the City Cafe in central Liverpool. Around 7:15 to 7:20 p.m., the club receives a phone call from a man calling himself R.M. Coltroff, who leaves a message asking Wallace to meet him the next evening for insurance business at 7:30 p.m. at 25 Menlove Gardens East. Wallace gets a message upon arriving at the club around 7:45 p.m. He does not recognize the name Coltroff, but notes down the address. Tuesday, January 20th, 1931, daytime. Wallace works his usual collection rounds for Prudential. He's seen by clients and acquaintances and behaves normally. He returns home in the late afternoon. That evening, despite misgivings about the strange appointment, Wallace decides to keep the meeting with Coltroff. January 20th, 1931, evening. Wallace leaves home around 6:45 p.m. to travel by tram to Menlove Gardens. He takes multiple trams across the city, arriving in the vicinity of Menlove Gardens around 7:30 p.m. He spends roughly 45 minutes searching in vain for the address, 25 Menlove Gardens East, which does not exist. Menlove Gardens North, South, and West exist, but there is no East. Wallace knocks on doors, including 25 Menlove Gardens West, and asks passerby and even a policeman for help, but no one has heard of Coltroff or Menlove Gardens East. January 20th, 1931, 8:45 p.m. Wallace abandons the search and returns home to 29 Wolverton Street. He finds his front door locked and no response from Julia. Going around back, he discovers that the back door, which had been bolted earlier, is now inexplicably unlocked on his second attempt to open it. Entering the house, he finds a horrifying scene in the front parlor. Julia's bloody body on the floor. She's been beaten to death. January 20, 1931, 8:45 to 9 o'clock p.m. Wallace summons his neighbors, the Johnstons at number 31, in a state of distress, telling them, "Come and see, she's been killed." The neighbors and then the police are called to the scene. Investigators find Julia's body in the parlor in a pool of blood. A bloody iron mackintosh, raincoat, belonged to William, is oddly crumpled under her corpse. The room upstairs are found in disarray, as if someone had been searching for valuables. Wallace's cash collection tin is uncovered in the kitchen, short about 4 pounds. It should have been there. January 20th to 25th, 1931. Liverpool police investigate. Wallace is questioned multiple times and gives several voluntary statements about his activities. He sticks to his story of the mysterious phone call and his fruitless trip to Menlove Gardens. Police begin to view his alibi with suspicion. February 2nd, 1931. After about 2 weeks of investigation, William Herbert Wallace is arrested, formally charged with the murder of his wife Julia. He professes his innocence. April 22nd to 27th, 1931. Wallace stands trial for murder at St. George's Hall in Liverpool. The case against him is entirely circumstantial. No eyewitness, no murder weapon found, and no clear motive. Nevertheless, after a short jury deliberation of about an hour, Wallace is found guilty on April 27th and sentenced to death by hanging. May 19, 1931. In a historic decision, the Court of Criminal Appeal in London quashes Wallace's conviction and overturns the guilty verdict. The judges rule that the verdict cannot be supported, having regard to the evidence. Wallace is thus acquitted on appeal. The first time in British legal history that a murder conviction was set aside due to lack of evidence. He is released from prison. No retrial is ordered, and the murder of Julia Wallace remains officially unsolved. 1932 to 1933. Wallace returns to work but faces public ostracism, as many neighbors and colleagues believe he got away with it. He receives hate mail and threats and eventually moves to a different area for privacy. On February 26, 1933, less than 2 years after his acquittal, William Wallace dies of kidney failure at age 54. He goes to his grave maintaining his innocence in Julia's murder. Now with the timeline in mind, let's delve deeper into the narrative of the crime, the investigation, and the various interpretations of this enduring mystery. Up next, the mysterious phone call. The mysterious phone call. The saga truly begins in the night of Monday, January 19, 1931, a smoky cafe in downtown Liverpool that served as a meeting place for the Central Chess Club. William Herbert Wallace was a regular attendee, a keen chess enthusiast, if not a particularly skilled one. That evening, Wallace was scheduled to play a chess tournament match. He arrived a bit late, around 7:45 p.m., delayed by the bitter weather and his fragile health. Shortly after he walked into the club captain, Samuel Beatty, approached him with an odd message that had arrived by telephone about 20 minutes earlier. Beatty explained that about 7:20 p.m., someone had phoned the city cafe asking for Mr. Wallace. The caller, who gave the name R.M. Qualtrough, had a peculiar request. He wanted Wallace to come the next evening to his address at 25 Menlove Gardens East to discuss a business matter, specifically to talk about insurance policies. Beatty handed Wallace a slip of paper where the details were written down. According to Beatty, Wallace read the message, furrowed his brow and muttered, "Qualtrough, Qualtrough. Who's Qualtrough?" "I don't know the man," Beatty replied. "Well, if you don't know, I don't either." Wallace had never heard the name before, and indeed it is an unusual surname. Nonetheless, he copied the address into his pocket notebook. Initially, he accidentally wrote 25 Menlove Gardens West, then scratched that out and corrected it to East. The small slip will later be scrutinized. Was it evidence of his genuine unfamiliarity with the address, having assumed the more common West, or Freudian mistake, betraying foreknowledge that East didn't exist? At the time, Wallace likely thought little of it. He told Beatty that he didn't recall any client named Qualtrough, but the details about discussing insurance sounded plausible. Perhaps it was a referral or a friend of a friend looking to buy a policy. Importantly, the phone call being placed not to Wallace's home, but the chess club's venue. In 1931, few private homes had telephones, and Wallace did not have one. To reach him, the caller had to know he would be at the club that night. Indeed, Wallace customarily attended on Mondays, and his name was listed in the club's roster. The call itself was later traced by police to a public telephone kiosk, Anfield Call Box 1627, a coin-operated K1 telephone booth located only about 400 yards from the Wallace home on Wolverton Street. This meant the caller Qualtrough had chosen a phone booth very close to Wallace's house to make contact, but had opted to ring the club rather than the house, likely because Julia was ill and they had no phone at home. According to operators who connected the call, the caller spoke in a calm, ordinary male voice with perhaps a cultured accent, certainly not gruff or agitated. The club's waitress who answered, Gladys Harley, also recalled the man's voice as normal and polite. Only Club Captain Beatty thought the caller's voice sounded somewhat gruff on the line, which later raised the intriguing possibility that the caller may be disguising his voice when forced to speak to someone who knew Wallace, in this case Beatty. At the time, Wallace appeared puzzled but not alarmed by the message. He mentioned to a fellow club member that the name Qualtrough was unfamiliar and peculiar. The chess club secretary, Mr. Caird, helped Wallace consider how to get to Menlove Gardens, offering one route suggestion. But Wallace said he might not even go if it seemed too troublesome, though he was inclined to take the more direct route if he did go. Wallace ended up playing his chess game. Accounts differ on whether he won or lost. Then he went home for the night, presumably to tell Julia about the appointment for the following evening. From a storytelling perspective, the stage was now set. We have a mysterious character, R.M. Qualtrough, summoning Wallace to an address that, unbeknownst to Wallace, does not exist. We have a phone call placed from a booth a stone's throw from Wallace's own house, suggesting the caller might have been in Wallace's neighborhood. The pieces of a perplexing puzzle were arranged. If someone intended to murder Julia Wallace, getting her husband out of the house via a fake appointment was a clever gambit. If, on the other hand, Wallace himself intended harm to his wife, creating a false errand for himself via a faked phone call will be an equally crafty alibi. This ambiguity sits at the heart of the Julia Wallace case. As one commentator later summarized, either the murderer was Wallace or it wasn't. If it wasn't, then here at last is the perfect murder. If it was, then here is a murder so nearly perfect that the Wallace case is unbeatable. The night of the murder, Tuesday, January 20th, 1931, began ordinarily for the Wallaces. That morning, William Wallace follows his normal routine, setting out around 10:30 a.m. to make his rounds collecting insurance premiums from clients. Several customers later testified that Wallace called on them that day and seemed his usual self, courteous, calm, and not in any particular hurry. Julia, still recovering from bronchitis, likely stayed indoors at 29 Wolverton Street for most of the day. By late afternoon, Wallace returned home to have tea with Julia in their kitchen, which they used as a cozy living room. The couple were seen by their neighbors, the Johnstons, chatting through the backyard fence early that evening. Nothing seemed amiss. Despite the strangeness of the Qualtrough message, Wallace evidently decided to honor the supposed appointment. Perhaps he thought it could lead to a valuable sale. In fact, one detail he noted was that Qualtrough mentioned a girl's 21st birthday policy, hinting at a lucrative endowment insurance policy that would yield Wallace a nice commission. So after an early supper around 6:45 p.m., Wallace donned his overcoat and bowler hat and set out to find 25 Menlove Gardens East. Julia, in her house clothes, stayed behind, likely planning a quiet evening by the hearth, perhaps doing a bit of ironing or reading by lamplight. She let her husband out through the front door, locking it behind him. It was the last time she was seen alive by anyone other than her killer. Wallace's journey across Liverpool that night has been painstakingly reconstructed from tram schedules and witness statements. He walked from Wolverton Street to a tram stop and caught the number 5 tram into the city centre, then transferred to another tram heading toward the southern districts. The Menlove Gardens address was in the suburb of Mossley Hill, an unfamiliar area to Wallace. After about 35 to 40 minutes in transit, he arrived in the vicinity of Menlove Gardens. Menlove Gardens is not a single street, but a quadrangle of 4 parallel residential streets arranged around a green. There are Menlove Gardens north, south, and west, forming 3 sides of a rectangle, but no Menlove Gardens east. Wallace began searching up and down these streets in the cold drizzle and dim glow of gas street lamps. He knocked on the door of 25 Menlove Gardens West at about 7:45 p.m. and asked the resident, a Mrs. Johnston, no relation to his neighbors, if this was 25 East and whether an R.M. Qualtrough lived there. Unsurprisingly, she told him he was at the wrong address. There was no East, and she didn't know any Qualtrough. Wallace then encountered a young woman on the street, Miss Lily Hall, and inquired if she knew of a Menlove Gardens East. She did not, but suggested he ask a policeman or try the post office nearby. Wallace walked to a spot in Green Lane, where he knew an acquaintance lived, his own manager at Prudential, who coincidentally resided in that area. Wallace had been to his manager's house before for violin lessons. Wallace knocked there, but nobody answered. He proceeded to a police constable he saw on the road, Constable Arthur Williams, and asked him about Menlove Gardens East. P.C. Williams confirmed what was becoming obvious. There was no such street in the district. Undeterred, Wallace made one more attempt. He entered a newsagent's shop at 8 o'clock p.m. to consult a street directory or ask a shopkeeper. The shopkeeper, too, could not find any listing for Menlove Gardens East, and had never heard of Qualtrough. By around 8:10 p.m., after nearly 45 minutes of fruitless searching, Wallace gave up. He later said at that point he concluded the whole thing must have been a hoax or prank. He walked to the tram stop and began the journey back home, retracing his route on the electric trams through the damp winter night. Back on Wolverton Street, sometime shortly before 8:45 p.m., neighbors John and Florence Johnson were stepping out of their house, number 31, to run an errand. They spotted William Wallace in the back alley behind the homes, looking agitated. Wallace told them he had returned home but found his house locked and dark, and he could not get his key to work in either the front or back door. Mr. Johnson accompanied Wallace to the back door of number 29 to try again. This time, strangely, the back door opened with ease. Wallace would later insist he had absolutely locked that door before leaving, and that it was bolted from the inside when he first returned, raising the eerie possibility that someone else had been inside moments earlier and unlatched it. Wallace entered through the small back kitchen, the scullery, and switched on the lights. The house was deathly quiet. With mounting alarm, he walked through the kitchen into the living room kitchen, an interior room they used as a sitting area, calling for Julia. Receiving no answer, he then opened the door to the front parlor, a formal sitting room the couple mostly kept closed and unheated except for special occasions. There his eyes met a ghastly sight, illuminated by his lantern. Julia lay face down on the rug by the fireplace in a sea of blood. Her head had been brutally battered. Wallace recoiled and ran back in the alley, crying out to Johnston, "Come and see! Someone's battered my wife!" or words to that effect. The Johnsons rushed into the parlor. They saw Julia's body on the floor amid overturned chairs and blood spattering the walls. She was clearly beyond help. Mr. Johnson hurried off to find a phone to call the police, while a stunned William Wallace stood over his wife's body. He was heard to mutter in shock, "They finished her. Look at her brains." Julia's skull had been crushed by the blows. Neighbors soon gathered, and within the hour police constables and an ambulance arrived on the scene. Julia Wallace had been attacked with ferocious violence. The subsequent post-mortem counted at least 11 separate head wounds, any one of which could have been fatal. It appeared she had been struck repeatedly with a heavy blunt instrument, possibly an iron bar or club, crushing her skull in multiple places. Blood had soaked into the carpet and even spattered on the walls and ceiling, indicating a frenzied assault. Yet curiously, there was no sign of a struggle by the victim. Julia's body position, lying face down, knees tucked under her as if she had crumpled forward, and the fact that her hands showed no defensive wounds, suggested she may have been taken by surprise and knocked down by the first blow from behind. Death was probably instantaneous, or nearly so, according to the pathologist, given the massive trauma. The only unusual object in the crime scene was William's mackintosh, or raincoat, which was found partially under Julia's corpse, heavily stained with her blood. It was almost as if she'd been wearing it, or it had been thrown over her. Wallace would later say the mackintosh had been hanging in the kitchen. He had no idea how it came to be under her. This mackintosh would become a critical piece of the puzzle, and of the prosecution's theory, as we'll see. As the police surveyed the rest of the house, they noted that things were disturbed. Upstairs, the spare bedroom, which the Wallaces used as storage and hobby room, was in disarray. Drawers pulled out, paper scattered. It looked like someone had rifled through belongings. Downstairs in the kitchen, Wallace's metal cash box, where he kept collection money, was sitting out in the open, and some money was missing from it. Wallace quickly pointed out to the police that about £4 was gone from the box, and remarked that normally on a Tuesday night, that box would contain far more. But because he'd been ill and missed work the previous week, he hadn't collected as much. So fortunately, or oddly, the takings were slim. It was as if the murderer had expected a larger haul. Indeed, Wallace suggested to officers on the scene that they would know I'd keep the cash box there, and that Tuesday was the day it would be fullest, implying that the culprit knew his routine, and likely was someone acquainted with him. Police and neighbors also looked for any signs of forced entry. The front door being locked from the inside. Wallace had struggled with it until he went around back. The back door had a lock and bolt. Wallace insisted he had locked it when leaving, yet it was unfastened upon his return. However, there was no sign of a break-in. No smashed window, no pried lock. Whoever killed Julia either had a key or was let inside by Julia herself. Given that Julia was very shy and generally only opened the door to known acquaintances, this pointed toward the killer being someone she recognized, or someone gaining entry on a ruse that lowered her guard. William Wallace himself was physically examined that night. Strikingly, he had no blood on him, not on his clothes, hands, or anywhere. His demeanor was noted as oddly calm, though in shock. Neighbors would later say Wallace's behavior oscillated between stunned blankness and brief, quiet sobs. He seemed genuinely shattered by Julia's death, but some found his composure strange under the circumstances. This reserve would later be used against him at trial, as observers debated whether it was shock or a calculating cold-bloodedness. The stage was now set for an intense investigation. In a matter of minutes, William Herbert Wallace had gone from distressed husband and witness to a potential suspect in the eyes of the police. How could a killer have known he'd be away from home at that hour, unless the killer was the very person who orchestrated the phone call? And if Wallace was the killer, how had he managed to bludgeon his wife to death in a narrow time window, and yet emerge without a drop of blood on his person? These questions formed the crux of what was soon to become a sensational case. Up next, the investigation. The investigation. Liverpool's finest detectives descended on 29 Wolverton Street that night and the days following, determined to crack the case. The first theory they entertained was that William Wallace himself had murdered his wife, using the elaborate Qualtrough ruse to create an alibi. After all, the majority of murders are committed by someone close to the victim, and the circumstances here, no forced entry, Julia likely admitting her killer, the highly convenient phone call, immediately cast suspicion on the husband. Yet at the same time, the investigators were confronted with puzzling elements that made Wallace's guilt far from straightforward. Forensic evidence at the scene. The forensic examination of the crime scene yielded both incriminating and exculpatory details regarding Wallace. On the one hand, the sheer bloodiness of the attack suggested that the perpetrator would have been heavily contaminated with blood. Julia's wounds bled profusely. Her attacker would almost certainly have blood in their clothing, hands, possibly even face. However, the suit Wallace had worn that evening, he was still wearing when police arrived, had no blood stains at all on it. The only item with blood was a mackintosh under Julia. How could Wallace have beaten his wife 11 times about the head and got no blood on his sleeves or trousers? It seemed implausible. The police responded to this problem with a rather startling hypothesis. They theorized that Wallace might have committed the murder in the nude, or partially undressed, and used the mackintosh as a shield or apron to catch the blood splatter. In other words, perhaps he wore the raincoat over his front and arms and nothing else, while striking Julia, then redressed in his clean suit afterward. This theory was, even at the time, acknowledged as somewhat far-fetched. It required Wallace, a 52-year-old in not great health, to strip naked in a cold house, bludgeon his wife, then meticulously clean up and dress, all within a matter of minutes, leaving no trace of blood in the wash basin or bath. And indeed, when the investigators checked the bathroom, no evidence of recent washing was found. The bathtub and sink were dry and clean, no wet towels, and only a single small clot of blood was found on the toilet bowl. That clot could have come from anything. An officer might have flicked it off a boot, for instance, and in fact it was later suggested that it likely resulted from inadvertent cross-contamination by police at the scene. In short, there was no sign that a murderer had taken a gore-soaked bath or scrubbed themselves clean in that house. The lack of blood in Wallace remained one of the strongest points in his favor. Another key piece of forensic evidence, or lack thereof, was the murder weapon. Despite extensive searches, the police never found a weapon conclusively identified as the one used to kill Julia. Early on, they suspected an iron bar or rod about 15 inches long, perhaps a heavy piece of iron used as a poker or chimney cleaning bar. In fact, the Wallace's cleaning lady would later report that a certain iron fire poker and possibly a short iron bar from the fireplace were missing from the home after the murder. She described the missing poker as about 9 inches long with a knob on the end, and the missing iron bar is about a foot long and as thick as a candle. Such objects could certainly be in the blunt instrument used. But if so, the killer took them away. Police searched drains and gutters in the area for any discarded metal bar, even prying up a few street grates, but found nothing. The elusive murder weapon added to the mystery. If Wallace was the killer, he would have had to dispose of the weapon somewhere during his travels around the time of the murder, or after calling the neighbors. If an intruder was the killer, that person likely carried the weapon out with them and vanished. Timeline and alibi. As investigators grilled Wallace in the days after the murder, the timeline became a crucial focus. Initially, the police surgeon on scene had estimated Julia's time of death to be around 8 o'clock p.m., based upon rigor mortis, body temperature, etc. This approximate time would have been after Wallace left home, circa 6:45, and before he returned at 8:45. In other words, it left open the possibility that someone else killed Julia while Wallace was away on the wild goose chase. However, as suspicion of Wallace grew, the authorities appeared to revise the time of death earlier to shortly after 6 o'clock p.m. By placing Julia's death around 6:05 to 6:15 p.m., the prosecution could argue that Wallace himself killed her before leaving for Menlove Gardens. They essentially faked his outing as an alibi after already committing the crime. This revision was controversial because it was not clearly supported by new medical evidence, but rather seemed motivated by investigative theory. One big problem with the notion Julia died closer to 6 o'clock p.m. was a witness named John Parks, the milk delivery boy. Parks testified that he had delivered milk to the Wallace's door at about 6:30 p.m. that evening, and he spoke to Mrs. Wallace at that time. If true, that means Julia was alive and well at 6:30, long after the prosecution alleged William had already killed her. This milk boy witness was a thorn in the side of the case against Wallace. The prosecution tried to cast doubt in the timing of his recollection, but Parks was adamant and had no apparent reason to lie. His testimony effectively left Wallace an extremely narrow window in which he could possibly have committed the frenzied crime, yet emerge blood-free and composed only minutes later to catch his tram. In fact, if Julia was alive at 6:30, Wallace would have had to kill her, clean up, and depart by about 6:45 to meet the tram, an almost impossible feat. This was precisely the point hammered by Wallace's defense later. Almost every piece of evidence could cut two ways, and the timeline in particular either exonerated him or condemned him, depending on how it was interpreted. Motive. Another facet of the investigation was the search for a motive. Why would William Wallace want to murder Julia, the woman who by all accounts he loved and cared for during 17 years of marriage? There was no suggestion of infidelity, no large insurance on her life, no obvious domestic strife. They were not wealthy, and Julia's death did not stand to benefit Wallace financially. In fact, meant the loss of his companion and likely further isolation. The prosecution essentially conceded that they could not establish a clear motive. Wallace's profile did not match that of a typical domestic murderer. Some speculate about a hidden resentment, or that Wallace, who was known as a somewhat intellectual and emotionally restrained man, might have harbored secret frustrations that boiled over, but this was guesswork. By contrast, a motive for robbery was plain if an intruder theory was pursued. Someone could have been after Wallace's insurance collections money. The fact that money was missing bolstered the robbery angle. However, the small sum taken, £4, the unnecessary violence used in Julia, far beyond what would be needed to incapacitate her during a theft, complicated the picture. As crime writer Dorothy L. Sayers observed, whoever killed Mrs. Wallace attained a distinction accorded to few murderers. His was the perfect crime. Undetected, unexplained, motiveless, unavenged. In other words, no motive that neatly fit all the facts was ever proven. The Qualtrough call. Investigators also tried to determine if Wallace himself could have been the mysterious Qualtrough caller. They established that the call was made from the telephone box a short walk from Wallace's house around 7:15 p.m. on the 19th. If Wallace had done this, he would have had to leave home, make the call, then travel by tram to the cafe and arrive by about 7:45, which was theoretically possible. In fact, Wallace's defense team privately conducted timing experiments to see if he could have done exactly that. They found it was indeed possible with minutes to spare, but interestingly, those timing results were never even introduced at trial, because the prosecution didn't strongly press the issue of the call's timing once Wallace had an explanation. Wallace claimed that he actually boarded the tram from a different stop than the one near the phone box, and in any event, an employee at the cafe who took the call swore that the voice in the phone was definitely not Wallace's. He had a distinctive voice, a Cumbrian accent, though soft from my years of living elsewhere, and the operators had noted the caller had a local Liverpool accent. Moreover, Wallace was seen by neighbors at about 6:50 p.m. leaving for the tram. There was no sighting of him around the phone booth around 7:15. So while police suspected Wallace as Qualtrough early on, they didn't have firm evidence of it. It remained an open question. Was the caller an accomplice, or the killer himself? Or was Wallace truly being lured by some third party? In sum, the investigation gathered circumstantial evidence that raised suspicions about Wallace, but it also uncovered facts that were hard to reconcile with his guilt. As one summary put it, almost every fact in the evidence was accepted by both prosecution and defense, but every fact could be interpreted in two ways. By the start of February 1931, under heavy pressure to solve the case, the public and press were clamoring, as we'll discuss later. The police felt they had enough to charge William Herbert Wallace. He was arrested for his wife's murder. Wallace, reportedly in a state of disbelief, simply replied, "What? I deny that," when the charge was read. He was taken into custody, and the case moved to the courts, where the drama intensified. Up next, trial and aftermath. Trial and aftermath. The trial of William Herbert Wallace for the murder of Julia Wallace opened on April 22, 1931, at the Liverpool Assizes, St. George's Hall. The courtroom was packed to the gills with spectators and press, eager to witness the unraveling of this baffling whodunit. It had the atmosphere of a classic detective novel, come to life. Indeed, journalists remarked that the case had all the maddening, frustrating fascination of a chess problem that ends in perpetual check, a nod to Wallace's chess playing and the irresolvable nature of the clues. From the outset, the prosecution admitted they had no direct evidence tying Wallace to the act of killing. There was no eyewitness, no confession, no forensic smoking gun like blood on his clothes or fingerprints on a weapon. Their case was built entirely on inferences. The elaborate alibi plot implying Wallace himself was Qualtrough. The implausibility of a mysterious outsider knowing Wallace's schedule, and Wallace's own behavior, which they painted as suspicious and inconsistent. They suggested that Wallace had planned to murder Julia and concocted the fake appointment to give himself cover, essentially accusing him of constructing a perfect alibi. The lead prosecutor went so far as to argue that no rational person could believe it was sheer coincidence that a prank caller happened to lure Wallace away in the very night his wife was murdered. Therefore, reasoned the Crown, Wallace must have been behind the call as part of a premeditated murder scheme. They advanced a timeline where Wallace killed Julia around 6:15 p.m., cleaned up, and then went out to play the role of the baffled insurance man searching for a non-existing address. They trotted out the theory of Wallace using the Macintosh as a shield while killing his wife in the nude. This scenario certainly raised eyebrows in court for its bizarreness, but the prosecution insisted it was possible. They argued the Macintosh under Julia's body had been used exactly for this purpose. An explanation for why that garment was so bloody while his suit was clean. As for the missing weapon, the Crown suggested Wallace could have easily hidden it along his route to Menlove Gardens, or dropped it down a drain, though none was found, or even still, had hidden it somewhere undetected. The motive the prosecution put forward was vague, lacking any clear financial or personal motive. They painted Wallace as an unhappy man worn down by failure and disappointment, who might have grown to resent his wife. There was insinuation that perhaps Julia's age, 17 years his senior, and their childless, quiet life weighed on him, and that years of striving and constant disappointment erupted in violence that night. This was psychological conjecture at best. But the prosecution frankly admitted one didn't need to prove motive if the facts pointed to guilt. A person could commit murder for reasons known only to themselves. The defense, led by eminent barrister Mr. Roland Oliver, systematically dismantled the prosecution's case as a series of improbabilities. Oliver emphasized that William Wallace had no history of violence or crime, was by all accounts a decent and mild individual, and had lived harmoniously with Julia. He then attacked the notion that Wallace could physically or logistically have done the crime. The timeline was his biggest ally. Oliver highlighted John Parks, the milk boy's testimony, that Julia was alive at 6:30 p.m., putting a huge dent in the supposed 6:15 time of death. If the jury believed the milk boy, Wallace simply could not have done it. He was undeniably away from 6:45 onward, and there was not enough time before. Even if they doubted the milk boy, Wallace had really slaughtered his wife and composed himself to calmly chat with a tram conductor minutes later. Several tram conductors and passengers were called who had seen Wallace on his journey to Menlove Gardens. All described him as normal in appearance, not sweating, not disheveled, no blood in him, nothing unusual except that he did ask one or two if they knew Menlove Gardens East, indicating he truly seemed to be searching. Oliver argued this was authentic behavior, not an act. The defense also hammered the forensic angle. Where was the blood in Wallace? If he did it, how did he remove all traces? They mocked the naked murder theory as bordering on absurd, requiring the jury to imagine the respectable Mr. Wallace in midwinter committing a grotesque act and somehow scrubbing every drop of blood from the scene and himself with no trace. One defense expert witness even suggested that given the blood spurting, Wallace would have needed to be as nimble as a ballet dancer to avoid getting stained if he wore nothing but a raincoat cape. Oliver also pointed out the cash box being left behind, only a few pounds taken, was a strong indicator of a robbery as a motive. Why would Wallace kill his wife and then randomly remove 4 pounds from his own collections? and scatter some papers upstairs. It made more sense that a thief who perhaps panicked and killed Julia, then grabbed what little cash he could and fled. The defense didn't have to prove who that hypothetical intruder was, only that such a scenario was reasonable doubt. Throughout the trial, observers noted Wallace's odd stoicism. He sat in the dock, almost detached, rarely emoting. When he took the stand in his own defense, his answers were calm, precise, sometimes overly elaborate, characteristic of his pedantic manner. Some jurors reportedly found his demeanor off-putting. He did not act like a stereotypical grieving, angry widower. F.J. Saulfield, a journalist present, commented, "What probably harmed Wallace most at his trial was his extraordinary composure, enigmatic his seeming indifference to his surroundings. Shock, callousness, stoicism, confidence? We shall never know." After summations, the judge, Mr. Justice Wright, gave the jury his instructions. In his summing up, the judge himself marveled at the case, saying, "This murder, I should imagine, must be almost unexampled in the annals of crime. Murder so devised and arranged that nothing remains which will point to anyone as the murderer." He acknowledged the unusual and circumstantial nature of the evidence. Nonetheless, the jury retired to deliberate. A mere 1 hour later, they returned with a verdict: guilty of willful murder. The announcement stunned many in the courtroom. Wallace himself finally showed emotion. He blanched and looked as if he might collapse. The judge had no choice but to pronounce the death sentence, and Wallace was led away to await execution at Wolverton Prison. The Liverpool public was sharply divided. Some felt vindicated. The calculating husband had been caught. Others were uneasy, sensing an innocent man might be convicted on a very shaky chain of reasoning. Wallace's employers at Prudential believed firmly in his innocence. In fact, the Prudential Staff Union had funded his defense and even conducted a private mock trial before the retrial, at which a panel had unanimously found him not guilty. Wallace did not have to wait long for another dramatic twist. His legal team immediately appealed the conviction to the Court of Criminal Appeal in London. On May 19, 1931, just 2 weeks before Wallace's scheduled execution, the 3 appeal judges delivered a historic judgment. They quashed the conviction outright, declaring that the jury's verdict cannot be supported having regard to the evidence. In essence, the appeals court ruled that the case against Wallace was so weak that it should never have led to a guilty verdict. It was a miscarriage of justice. This was unprecedented. Usually appeals in that era succeeded only if there was an error in law or new evidence. Here, the court took the extraordinary step of saying the jury was wrong, as a matter of fact, effectively, that no reasonable jury should have convicted on that evidence. As one report noted, the decision implied there was no evidence against Wallace in a legal sense required for conviction. William Herbert Wallace was thus acquitted and walked free. The murder charge dropped. Importantly, under the double jeopardy rules of the time, he could not be tried again for the same crime, so the case remained officially unsolved. Wallace's reaction to the appeal victory was restrained relief. He reportedly broke down in tears once out of sight. Overwhelmed, they would not hang. However, freedom did not bring peace. Wallace returned to his job in his now empty home, but he found himself shunned in the community. Many of his former insurance clients refused to let the murderer into their homes. He received hate mail accusing him of butchering Julia. On the streets, local youths jeered at him. At one point, Wallace even received a death threat note, implying the writer would avenge Julia. Under this pressure, Wallace moved to a different part of Merseyside, a village on the Wirral, and took a more back-office job away from face-to-face client work. In private, according to his diary, Wallace was grieving deeply for Julia. He wrote of his anguish at losing her and wondered if they would reunite in the afterlife. Intriguingly, he also wrote of his growing belief in the guilt of a former colleague as Julia's killer, and expressed fear that he himself might be killed by this person. Wallace never named this individual in his diary, but decades later this clue would make sense, as we'll see when we discuss a man called Perry. Less than 2 years after his acquittal, on February 26, 1933, William Wallace died of uremia, kidney failure, complicated by pyelonephritis at age 54. It's often said that he died of a broken heart, or due to the stress and ostracism he endured. He was buried beside Julia in a Liverpool cemetery, their shared grave reading, "Peace, perfect peace." In death, Wallace could no longer be tried by human courts, but the court of public opinion would continue to try and retry him for decades to come, as the mystery of Julia's murder only grew in legend. Up next, media sensation and public fascination. Media sensation and public fascination. From the moment the story broke in January 1931, the Wallace case became a media sensation. The press had a field day with the elements of the story: the respectable insurance man and his wife in their little home, the cloak and dagger phone call by a Mr. Qualtrough, the locked room feel of an impossible crime, the dramatic arrest and trial. Newspapers across Britain and even abroad cover the case extensively, feeding the public's appetite for every new tale and rumor. The Liverpool papers provided daily coverage of the investigation and the trial, often with lurid headlines. National dailies like the Times and Daily Mirror sent reporters to cover the trial in detail, and their front pages blared updates like "Chess player sentenced to death, Wallace guilty," on the day of the verdict. The elements of mystery were played up. One paper dubbed it the Liverpool chessboard murder, emphasizing the chess and strategy angle. Another called it the Qualtrough enigma. The alliterative allure of Wallace's wife's slang and similar catchphrases appeared in print. Readers followed along as if it were a serialized detective novel. Public interest was intense in Liverpool. Outside St. George's Hall during the trial, crowds gathered, strained to get updates. When the guilty verdict was announced, there were audible gasps and even cheers from some who thought justice was done, while others muttered that an innocent man was being doomed. When Wallace's conviction was overturned on appeal, it was headline news. It challenged the public's understanding of justice. Many had never heard of a convicted killer being set free like that. Some editorials applauded the appeals court for rectifying a probable wrongful conviction. Others lamented that a clever murderer had now evaded punishment. The case also captivated people because it occurred in an era when crime reporting was becoming mass entertainment. The early 1930s saw the public fascinated by true crime stories, an escape from the grim realities of the Depression. The Wallace case had almost literary qualities that made it stand out even among sensational crimes. As noted in The Guardian, the murder of Julia Wallace compares only to the Ripper murders in 1888, the amount of writing, both fiction and non-fiction, which it has created. Indeed, it became one of the most written about British murders, second perhaps only to Jack the Ripper. Contemporary papers published detailed crime scene diagrams and even speculative cartoons of how Wallace might have carried out the killing. Magazines ran investigative features, and the case was discussed in radio programs of the day. Public opinion was split and often passionate. In Liverpool, many locals felt Wallace must be guilty. It was just too elaborate a coincidence otherwise. The idea of the mild man from Peru turning out to be a wife killer was shocking, yet perversely fascinating. Many could not let go of the thought that Wallace had somehow committed the perfect murder. Others believed Wallace had been the victim of a diabolical frame-up or an unsolvable mystery, and they had sympathy for him. This debate played out in letters to newspaper editors, in pub conversations, and at family dinner tables. It was, in modern terms, a true crime craze. Even after Wallace's death in 1933, interest in the case did not wane. Each time a new revelation or theory emerged, the press would revive the story. For instance, in 1934, a crime writer named Winifred Duke published a book called 6 Trials, which included the Wallace case. She coyly referred to the murderer by a pseudonym, Mr. Harris, which readers later realized was a clue pointing to a real suspect's Welsh surname, Perry. Such hints kept people guessing. Over the years, various newspapers and magazines would occasionally run pieces like Who Really Killed Julia?, recounting the mystery for new audiences. The Wallace murder has since become part of Liverpool folklore. To this day, local history tours in Liverpool often include the tale of Julia's murder. The house at 29 Wolverton Street still stands, remarkably surviving wartime bombing and redevelopment, and it draws the occasional crime buff tourist to gaze at the modest home where the impossible murder happened. The fact that the case remains officially unsolved adds to its lasting mystique, ensuring that each generation hears about the puzzle that stumped the experts. Mystery writers and theories. Perhaps no unsolved murder in Britain has drawn as much analysis and theorizing from writers, especially mystery novelists, as the Julia Wallace case. It has been said that the case provides an unrivaled field for speculation to the detective novelists such as P.D. James, writer of the Adam Dalgliesh mystery series. Over the decades, many prominent writers and criminologists have offered their 2 cents on who done it and how it was done, sometimes with wildly different conclusions. This engagement has elevated the case to almost legendary status in crime literature. Raymond Chandler, the famed American crime novelist, creator of Philip Marlowe, was fascinated by the Wallace murder and wrote about it in his essays and letters. Chandler lauded it as the nonpareil of all murder mysteries. The impossible murder, because Wallace couldn't have done it, and neither could anyone else. He noted the unique feature that every piece of evidence seems to cancel out one another piece. A true conundrum that ends in stalemate. Chandler essentially admitted that if Wallace was innocent, then a genius perpetrator executed the perfect crime. And if Wallace was guilty, he nearly achieved the same perfect result. Chandler did not propose a definitive solution. Rather, he expressed deep admiration for the case's complexity. In one oft-quoted line, Chandler said, "The Wallace case is unbeatable. It will always be unbeatable." Coming from a master of fictional mysteries, as a testament to how baffling the real case is. Dorothy L. Sayers, one of Britain's top detective novelists of the 1920s and 30s, creator of Lord Peter Wimsey, also studied the Wallace case intently. Sayers contributed an essay on it, titled The Wallace Mystery, or sometimes referenced in The Anatomy of Murder Anthology, in which she famously remarked, "The Wallace murder had no key move, and ended, in fact, in stalemate." To Sayers, the case was like an unfinished game of chess where no checkmate is possible. Every move is countered by another interpretation. She did analyze various scenarios, but ultimately she did not commit to a single theory of Wallace's guilt or innocence. Sayers and some fellow members of London's Detection Club, a society of mystery writers, used to debate the case in gatherings, treating it as the ultimate intellectual puzzle. Her conclusion was that for a novelist, the Wallace case was a goldmine. It provides for the detective novelist an unrivaled field for speculation. Indeed, she noted that almost any imaginative solution could be spun, but reality had left it unresolved. Over the years, numerous true crime authors tackled the case in books, each often pushing a particular theory. The first major full-length study was by W.F. Wyndham Brown, who in 1933 published The Trial of William Herbert Wallace, including trial transcripts. This kept interest alive in the immediate aftermath. In 1949, author John Rowland wrote The Wallace Case, highlighting the two-faced nature of the evidence. Every fact could be interpreted in two ways. Rowland leaned toward Wallace's innocence. A 1969 definitive account by journalist Jonathan Goodman titled The Killing of Julia Wallace was published, later reprinted many times. Goodman's work is highly respected. He carefully sifted primary sources and ultimately hinted at an alternative suspect without naming him. But readers and later researchers deduced he meant Richard Perry, about whom more soon. Goodman firmly believed Wallace had been wrongfully accused and that another person was likely responsible, though he presented the evidence even-handedly. P.D. James, the acclaimed crime novelist, was a writer who both engaged with the case in fiction and later put forth her own theory. In her 1982 detective novel, The Skull Beneath the Skin, she drew inspiration from the Wallace case for a plot element, a murder where an appointment is used as a lure. Later in 2003's The Murder Room, her detective character, Adam Dalgleish, and others explicitly discussed the Wallace case as an example of an unsolved mystery. Finally, in 2013, at age 93, P.D. James wrote an article for the Sunday Times magazine declaring that she had an absolute conviction about the solution. Her conclusion? William Wallace did kill Julia, but the Qualtrough call was made by Richard Gordon Perry as a prank. In James's view, Perry, a young ex-colleague of Wallace, might have wanted petty revenge on Wallace for some workplace grievance and sent him on a wild goose chase, never intending to facilitate murder. But Wallace seized this perfect coincidence as an opportunity to eliminate his wife. James argued that the odds of a prank call and a genuine, unrelated murder happening the same night were astronomical. Thus, she thought it had to be a combination of the two, a scenario she admitted no rational person would normally believe, except that she did. She even speculated on the mechanics. Wallace, she wrote, likely struck Julia with an iron fire poker, having stripped to his underwear and covered himself with a mackintosh, and that the timeline did allow him to catch the tram after cleaning up. James ultimately felt that while the court acquitted Wallace, in the end justice was done, only the fallible justice for men. In other words, she believed Wallace was guilty, and that his initial conviction, though legally quashed, was substantively correct. Not all writers agree with P.D. James, of course. Before we delve more into suspects like Perry, it's worth noting that others have been proposed by various researchers over time. For an example, an author named Colin Wilson once mused that the case might have been devised by Agatha Christie and retains its tantalizing unsolved quality. He didn't solve it either, but expressed interest. Some enthusiasts have pointed fingers at random figures. Even a notion that the Johnstons, the neighbors, might have been involved, or that a mysterious lover of Julia's existed. These theories lack any evidence and haven't been taken seriously by historians. One interesting anecdote came from Annabelle Carlton, Ann Carlton, in 2017. She recounted a story involving her father, Sir Stanley Holmes, whose young man visited Wallace in prison after the conviction at Wallace's request. According to Carlton, Wallace confided to her father the name of the man he thought was the murderer. Holmes recognized the name as someone he knew from school, a bad lot, who some years later ended up in legal trouble for another matter. Carlton speculated that Wallace may have believed the city's establishment was protecting this person, the implication being the suspect was from a well-connected local family, and that Wallace was prosecuted as a distraction from the real culprit. Carlton stops just short of naming the person, but strongly hints that it was Perry, whom her parents had known as a youth. This second-hand account, while not hard evidence, adds to the lore that Wallace himself, until his dying day, suspected Perry and even feared him. Up next, who was Richard Gordon Perry? Who was Richard Gordon Perry? Now, who was Richard Gordon Perry? Perry was a 22-year-old who worked under Wallace at the Prudential Office until 1928. He was personable, flashy, and something of a Jack the Lad, a cocky young man about town. Wallace had discovered Perry once fudging the books and pocketing collections. Wallace reported it, or at least caused Perry to be reprimanded, and Perry left the company under a cloud. Perry was also acquainted with Julia. He visited the Wallace home before, and Julia was fond of him in a motherly way. By 1931, Perry was working elsewhere but was known to be struggling financially and living beyond his means. Importantly, Perry had a car, unusual for the time, and on the night of the murder he was seen driving around. Perry became a prime suspect in the eyes of some investigators and authors later on, though in 1931 the police did interview him, and he provided an alibi. It was Roger Wilkes, a BBC radio producer, who dug up the most damning information on Perry. In 1980-81, Wilkes was preparing a radio documentary for the 50th anniversary of the case. He located Perry's former girlfriend, fiancée at the time, Lily Lloyd, and another woman, Olivia Brine, who revealed that Perry's alibi might have been false. Perry had told police he was with friends from about 5:30 to 8:30 p.m. on January 20th. Lily Lloyd initially backed him up. But years later, after Perry jilted her, Lloyd reportedly confided that she had lied to protect him. Meanwhile, Olivia Brine stated that Perry was at her house with some friends that evening, but only until 8:30 p.m. Crucially, if Perry left at 8:30, he would have had ample time to drive the short distance to Wolverton Street by 8:45, potentially just before Wallace returned home, perhaps explaining the curious backdoor situation. Wilkes also tracked down a retired mechanic, John Parks, not to be confused with the milk boy of the same name. He worked at a garage Perry frequented. Parks recounted a story that on the night of the murder, Perry brought his car into the garage very late to be hosed down inside and out, and that Parks noticed one of Perry's gloves in the car was soaked in blood. According to Parks, Perry nervously said he had hit a dog. Wilkes found this explosive and featured it in his program, naming Perry as the likely killer. It turned out Perry had died just a few months before Wilkes' investigation. Perry lived until 1980, having quietly retired to North Wales under an assumed name, Dick Perry. So Perry was never publicly confronted in person. However, back in the 1960s, Jonathan Goodman had actually found Perry in London and had a doorstep conversation. Goodman reported that Perry displayed an astonishing, detailed knowledge of the Wallace case, far beyond what a casual reader would know, including knowing which minor witnesses had died. And Perry smugly refused to talk about it at all, saying, "I won't talk. Not if you were to offer me £2,000. Such behavior only fueled suspicion that Perry knew more than he ever admitted. The case against Perry, as synthesized by authors like Wilkes and later researchers, runs like this. Perry, needing money and knowing Wallace's schedule, orchestrated a plan to rob Wallace. He knew Tuesday was collection day, lots of cash on hand, and that Wallace visited the chess club Monday nights. Perry, or an accomplice he directed, made the Qualtrough phone call from the local box to ensure Wallace would be out at a specific time the next night. On January 20th, once Wallace was out, Perry went to the Wallace home. Julia, knowing him, likely let him in without hesitation, or perhaps he posed as coming on business from the Prudential, etc. Perry began rifling for the cash box. At some point, Julia either questioned him or he lost his nerve, and he struck her with a weapon. Perhaps that missing fireplace bar or poker, to silence her, a crime that escalated from planned theft to murder. He flees, taking the money and weapon. He drives off in his car and later desperately cleans it due to blood transfer, the glove with blood in the car, etc. Perry had created an alibi with friends, cards at a woman's house, but may have slipped out during the gathering briefly, if the timeline allowed, or left right at 8:30, making it tight but conceivable to do the deed, perhaps at 8:15, and then dash. Some versions have him maybe at the Wallace house earlier. That conflicts with the milk boy, unless the milk boy was slightly off or Perry visited Julia, chatted, left, then came back. In any event, Perry's knowledge of Wallace's movements is central. Only someone aware of Wallace's chess night and comfortable calling the club could have set this in motion, aside from Wallace himself. And Perry fits that bill. Critics of the Perry theory note that Olivia Bryant's statement, if true, actually covers Perry fully until 8:30 p.m., leaving a very narrow window, if any, for him to murder Julia. The Wallace home was a 15-minute drive from Bryant's. Also, Bryant's testimony came out decades later. There's some confusion. Did Perry leave earlier and return? Did someone else do the deed in his behalf? These uncertainties remain. A recent researcher, Rod Stringer, posited in 2008, as cited by Anthony M. Brown in 2018, that Perry might have indeed been the mastermind, but hired an unknown accomplice to do the actual burglary and assault. In that scenario, Perry makes the call and acts as lookout driver, while a henchman enters the house and accidentally kills Julia when discovered. This is speculative, but attempts to reconcile Perry's alibi with his possible involvement. Brown ultimately concluded this two-person distraction burglary gone wrong theory best fit the evidence. To this day, no consensus has been reached. The Wallace case remains a popular subject of debate in books, forums, and even mock trials. In 1977, the Merseyside Medical Legal Society held a mock retrial of Wallace with a judge and barristers, and the jury again returned a verdict of not guilty. This suggests that modern legal minds, re-examining the evidence, tend to doubt Wallace's guilt. The mystery writers, however, often relish the ambiguity rather than resolve it. As novelist Edgar Lusgarten wrote, as a mental exercise, the Wallace murder is in a class by itself. Any set of circumstances extracted from it will readily support two incompatible hypotheses. And the famous critic, James Augate quipped, "Either the murderer was Wallace or it wasn't. If it wasn't, then here at last is the perfect murder." The legacy of all this literary and investigative attention is that Julia Wallace's murder has achieved a kind of cult status as the ultimate whodunit. It's often included in lists of great unsolved crimes. It has inspired elements in fiction, from novels to TV episodes. Yet despite the many theories, no one has ever been officially held responsible for Julia's death, except the man who was legally acquitted. The rich array of commentary, from Chandler's Law to P.B. James's firm conviction, shows how each interpreter sees in the case a reflection of their own detective philosophy. Chandler saw insoluble mystery. James saw a puzzle to finally crack with logic. Up next, forensic science, then and now. Forensic science, then and now. One aspect that makes the Wallace case particularly intriguing is how it highlights the forensic limitations of the 1930s compared to modern crime solving. In 1931, many of the scientific tools and techniques we take for granted today in homicide investigations simply did not exist or were in their infancy. If the Julia Wallace murder were investigated with today's forensic science, it might have been solved. At the time of the investigation, forensic work was largely limited to careful observation, rudimentary blood analysis, and medical examinations. Fingerprinting was an established practice. Police did dust for prints in burglary cases. But in the Wallace case, there wasn't an obvious place to lift a fingerprint. The murderer likely wore gloves, as hinted by the blood-soaked glove Perry allegedly had. No fingerprint evidence was ever reported in this case. Blood analysis in 1931 could determine human versus animal blood and blood group to some extent. Had they found blood in Wallace's clothes, they could potentially compare it to Julia's blood type. Since Wallace's suit was clean, that was moot. The Macintosh was drenched in Julia's blood, but that was expected since it was under her body. No testing beyond visual examination was done on it. They did not have DNA analysis, which today could theoretically test of any other person's DNA, saliva, sweat, skin cells, was on Julia's clothing or under her fingernails. Julia's nails might have been scraped for tissue if she had scratched the assailant, but apparently she did not get the chance to fight back. Time of death estimation in 1931 relied on very imprecise indicators: rigor mortis, body temperature cooling, and stomach contents. The pathologist's initial estimate around 8 o'clock p.m. was later adjusted by investigators, arguably to suit a theory rather than because of new medical finding. Today, forensic pathologists might use vitreous humor chemistry, eye fluid potassium levels, more rigorous body temperature formulae, and analysis of stomach contents, gastric emptying to narrow the time of death. Still, even now, time of death estimates can be off by an hour or more. It's not an exact science unless there is a witness or a more precise clue, like a smartwatch stopping or something. In Wallace's case, modern forensics might have better affirmed whether Julia died closer to 6:30 or 8 o'clock by cross-checking multiple indicators. Given the conflicting witness testimony, Milk Boy, the human evidence would still be crucial. Bloodstain pattern analysis was not a developed field in 1931. Investigators noted the general scene, but likely did not analyze spatter angles or velocity to deduce positions of attacker and victim. Today, an expert might examine the blood spraying walls or the cast-off patterns to determine the height and handedness of the assailant or whether the killer is moving. For instance, if Wallace had done it, one might expect some cast-off blood in the ceiling or upper walls in line with his height. He was tall. If an intruder shorter than Wallace did it, patterns could differ. Without the original crime scene photos, which do exist in archives, and a trained analyst, this is speculative, but it's an example of how modern forensic teams could glean clues. A modern analyst might also examine the trajectory of the blows. Were they mostly right-handed blows from behind? Could they match Wallace, who was right-handed, or indicate a left-handed attacker? These nuances weren't explored at the time. Trace evidence. One of the most significant forensic misses in the Wallace case is the absence of any trace evidence collection. In modern times, investigators would carefully vacuum and swab the scene for hair, fibers, shoe prints, etc. Julia's clothing might have had a stranger's hair or fiber from their clothing. The floor might hold a shoe impression and blood. The Macintosh might have had a bloody footprint or a tear with a fragment from the weapon. In 1931, none of this was done to our knowledge. They didn't have methods to collect or analyze such microscopic evidence effectively. If the killer was someone other than Wallace, potentially their physical traces went undetected. One intriguing forensic detail mentioned in later analysis: the pattern of Julia's head wounds. A forensic expert consulted decades later by researchers observed a repeating patterned injury in her skull fractures, suggesting the weapon might have had a distinctive shape or surface. This expert opined that an ordinary smooth bar or rod would likely not cause such repeating patterns unless it had a specific feature, like a knob or a crosshatch. This lends credence to the idea that perhaps a short fire poker with a knob known to be missing was the weapon, as its knob could create a repeating depressed fracture pattern with each blow. Modern forensic pathology could have identified the weapon by the wounds more definitively, possibly leading police to search for that exact object. Another area of change is forensic psychology and interviewing. Back then, Wallace was interrogated in a relatively informal way. No taped interviews, no psychological profiling. Today, investigators might conduct a cognitive interview, or even a polygraph, lie detector, to gauge Wallace's veracity. Polygraphs are not foolproof, but they can sometimes be a tool. Behavioral analysis might note that Wallace's immediate actions, calling neighbors, etc., were consistent with innocence, or not. Some modern profilers have looked at the case and noted that the staged robbery, where only a small amount is taken, as here, can indicate a domestic homicide staged to look like an outside job. However, the reverse can also be argued. Real intruder might have been scared off and not taken time to gather more loot. Importantly, the telephone call trace was a 1931 forensic feat of sorts. The manual phone exchange logs allowed investigators to pinpoint the exact kiosk used and time dialed. Today, of course, we'd have call records, cell tower pings, perhaps CCTV footage of the phone booth. In 1931, a lucky error by the caller, pressing the wrong button on the coin box, as later recounted by the operator, caused an exchange supervisor to log the call attempt with the phone box number and time. That serendipitous logging was key evidence. In a modern context, if such a call were made, it might be traced faster and maybe even tied to a phone card or fingerprints on the booth. Finally, DNA evidence. If Julia's clothing or the Macintosh or other items had been preserved, they likely were not or have been lost to time. Modern DNA testing might reveal skin cells or blood of a person other than Julia or Wallace. For instance, Perry being the killer and cut himself or left saliva, saved from speaking or a cough, on the scene. Today's methods might detect it. In famous cold cases, old evidence has sometimes yielded DNA profiles decades later, leading to identification. However, given Wallace's acquittal and the passage of time, it's doubtful any usable evidence was kept. Also, since Perry died in 1980, even if a DNA profile unmatched to Wallace, Julia was found, It only proves someone else was there, not necessarily named Perry, without a reference sample, which could only be obtained if, say, yet living relatives and a familial match could be done, or if some personal items of Perry's retained DNA. The Wallace case, in many ways, sits on the cusp between old-fashioned detective work and the modern forensic era. It was investigated in a time when a lot depended on intuition, witness statements, and luck. Modern readers often fantasize if only we could apply 21st century crime scene techniques, we might definitively solve it. Perhaps we would. Or perhaps some of the mystery writers suggest the Wallace murder is so cleverly contrived that even the best technology could fail to conclusively unravel it. As it stands, it remains a chilling reminder of how a few unanswered questions can echo through history. Up next, the conclusion, an enduring puzzle. Conclusion, an enduring puzzle. Nearly 95 years have passed since Julia Wallace was brutally slain in her parlor, and her murder remains an enigma that continues to tantalize and frustrate in equal measure. The case has all the ingredients of a classic whodunit: a bizarre setup, a closed circle of possible suspects, conflicting clues, and a clever alibi. Yet it lacks a final chapter where the detective gathers everyone and points the finger at the culprit. In the real story of Julia's murder, the final chapter was never definitively written. William Herbert Wallace walked free, neither officially guilty nor officially exonerated in the eyes of the world. A man who lived out his last days under clouds of suspicion and fear. No other person was ever charged, and the police file lingered open until it faded into the archives. For the public and lovers of mystery, the Wallace case endures because it invites us to play detective. It is a narrative that can be revisited again and again, each time allowing a new theory to be spun. Was Wallace truly the cold-blooded mastermind, the mild-mannered chess player who thought he could outwit the law? Or was he an innocent victim of circumstance, ensnared by someone else's ruthless design? Or could the truth be something more convoluted? The convergence of a prank and a crime, as P.D. James postulated, or a burglary that went terribly wrong at the worst possible time? What makes puzzles so persistent is that strong arguments can be made on both sides, and every argument seems to spawn a counter-argument. As one contemporary writer observed, the case began to assume the unique character for which it is famous. It was not so much that the weight of the evidence swung evenly from one side or the other. It was that the entire evidence pointed equally convincingly in both directions. In other words, reading the Wallace case is like looking at one of those optical illusions. Is it a rabbit or a duck? Your perception flips back and forth. Small wonder that many who delved into the case became a bit obsessed. The case's legacy also lives on in how it influenced the genre of detective fiction. It blurred the line between fact and fiction. Real policemen grappled with a scenario as perplexing as anything found in novels, and novelists in turn were inspired by the real case to craft new stories. In the grand timeline of crime history, Julia Wallace's murder stands as a landmark of mystery for mystery's sake. A case that seems to exist to challenge our wits and assumptions. At the end of an hour spent absorbing the details, we might find ourselves no closer to a certain solution. But perhaps that is fitting. The Wallace mystery invites us to consider the limits of knowledge and proof. It reminds us that real life doesn't always tie up neatly. Sometimes justice is uncertain and truth elusive. As Raymond Chandler said, The Wallace case is a nonpareil of all murder mysteries. It will always be unbeatable. So far, he has been correct. Every so often a new article, book, or documentary comes along claiming to have solved the Wallace case. Yet debate quickly resumes, and the mystery remains unbeaten. Writing this narrative, we've laid out the known facts, the compelling theories, and the voices of those who have examined the case before. The facts allow multiple interpretations, and each reader may lean toward a different culprit. Was it Wallace? Was it Perry? Was it someone else entirely? The evidence presented from the phone call and tram rides of the bloodstains and alibis is a chessboard in which this game plays out. It is only appropriate that William Wallace's hobby of chess becomes a metaphor. The case truly is a chess problem that ends in stalemate. A perpetual check with no checkmate. Perhaps a final thought should be reserved for Julia, the victim at the center whose voice we never heard. In the furor over solving the puzzle, it's easy to lose sight of the human tragedy. A woman's life brutally taken. Julia Wallace, by all accounts a gentle soul, deserved justice. Whether that justice was miscarried or simply never found is a haunting coda of this story. In the absence of a conclusive answer, the best we can do is continue to tell her story clearly and honestly, examine the evidence with open minds, and keep the discussion alive. The murder of Julia Wallace remains an open case in spirit. So after weighing everything presented here, the timeline, the clues, the analysis, old and new, what do you think happened on that cold winter night in 1931? The classic murder mystery retains its grip, inviting each new audience to scrutinize the evidence and put forward their own theory. And as long as the Wallace case is talked about, debated, and studied, Julia's memory endures and the pursuit of truth continues, however elusive that truth may be. Do you have a theory? We would certainly love to hear it and discuss it further. I'm Jay Nickel, and this has been Ontario Cold Cases, Canada's True Crime Podcast. If you found this episode compelling, moving, or important, please subscribe, rate, and review. It helps us continue to bring forgotten cases like these back into the light. You can find Ontario Cold Cases wherever you get your podcasts: Spotify, Apple, Amazon, Substack, and more. And remember, sometimes the coldest cases are the ones that need us the most. And until next time, stay safe, stay curious. Never stop asking questions. Because every case deserves answers, and every victim deserves justice.